This video is a compilation of all of the side quests available in Seyda Neen, featured in the Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind. In total, there are 4 that take place in the village, and I decided to also throw in an extra one that takes place in the Bitter Coast region, mostly because of its proximity to Seyda Neen, but also because it's the only one in that area. The quests for today go as follows: a falling wizard, Fargoth's ring, Fargoth's hiding place, Vodunius Nuccius, and death of a Taxman. Without further ado, let's begin the journeys. Beginning with a falling wizard, this quest is quite short but honestly a lot of fun. My favorite little occurrence was exiting Seyda Neen and taking the road west. Just a small ways down, I saw a book on the ground and then this happened. Getting in close to see what had just happened, it appears as though a wizard had just fallen from the sky and is now dead. Underneath the wizard, whose name was Tariel, lay his journal. The journal had value, so I took it. It details his work on creating a spell that allows him to leap great distances, seemingly as a form of fast travel. He was so certain that he got it right, and maybe he did, but he's now dead because of it. Peering into his inventory, Tariel had some pretty good gear, like an iron spark sword, a couple of scrolls, as well as some armor for my character to use. These Icarian flight scrolls are simply amazing and offer the player a glimpse at what is arguably the most efficient way of traveling around the island. They allow you to leap great distances while moving at a quick pace. Of course, the issue is the landing, as if you're not prepared, your character will take damage and even potentially die. Like I said, this quest is really brief and was probably more so meant to show the player the various forms of transportation available in the game. With that, thus ends the quest, a falling wizard, and we can now move on to the quests actually inside of Seyda Neen. Let's hear the tales of Fargoth's ring and Fargoth's hiding place featured in the Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind. As per usual, this story will feature facts and information from the game itself and the unofficial Elder Scrolls pages. For many, Fargoth could have very well been the first NPC interacted with after going through the tutorial and game setup in Seyda Neen. These several quests involving him begin with happening upon an enchanted ring in a barrel in the Census and Excise courtyard. This is the game's way of introducing the player to magical items. The engraved ring of healing in of itself can certainly prove useful, especially to lower level players. You can tap it for 4 uses, and it replenishes anywhere from 1 to 5 health points on self. After leaving the Census and Excise office, the player may stumble on the wood elf, Fargoth, pacing back and forth just outside of the building.
If there is anything I can do, I am humbly at your service.
Speaking with him, he says it's strange to see a boat arrive at such a time, asks if you're okay, and notes that the Imperial Legion officers can be rough. He then finishes off by swearing that they took his ring. The player then has the option of inquiring about the missing jewelry piece. Upon doing so, Fargoth details that the guards likely took it, as every week or so they like to give him a hard time. He says it's an engraved ring of healing, exactly the same as the one the player had just obtained. He ends with mentioning that it's a family heirloom and asks if you've seen it. This is where you're faced with 2 options. One is to hand over the piece of jewelry, and the other is to lie and say that you haven't seen it. The latter results in Fargoth's disappointment, and he says to let him know if you happen across it. The former, however, can branch out into 2 more options. If you give him the wrong ring, brought on by not having his in your inventory and instead having any other ring, he'll become upset and chastise you, resulting in a disposition decrease of 5. Otherwise, by handing him the correct enchanted ring, he'll become ecstatic and thank you for finding it. He calls the player his favorite friend and says he'll put in a good word around town for you, especially to Auril at the local trade house. This results in a plus 50 disposition increase with Fargoth and a plus 40 disposition increase with Auril. For players early in their playthroughs as well as loyal customers of the Seyda Neen trade house, this can have an effect on buying and selling goods, as Auril is likely to give you better deals. While some, mainly myself, believe this to be the end of Fargoth's involvement with the player, it turns out that there's much more story to be told. The game cleverly nudges the player into the direction of the trade house, which is where the setup for the second quest, Fargoth's hiding spot, begins. Important to note though is that the previous quest does not have to be completed before starting this one. After exploring Aryl's wares, you might be curious about the latest rumors to circulate Seyda Neen. Aryl will inform you that Hriskar Flatfoot, a Nord on the second floor of the shop, is having money troubles. If the player takes it upon themselves to learn more about it from the man himself,
"You're on your honor. Don't press your luck."
Hriskar opens up the conversation by saying that you could use a friend in these parts and directly asks for your help in recovering some gold. Inquiring about recovering the gold, he'll say that he had a bout of bad luck whilst playing a game called Nine Holes. Normally he has extra money on him, hinting that he shakes down the locals in exchange for some type of quote-unquote protection. Lately though, a lot of them have been holding out on him, and he specifically calls out Fargoth as one of the main culprits, or, depending on how you look at it, victims. It turns out that Hriskar is actually a member of the Imperial Legion, so Fargoth isn't very far-fetched in expressing his concerns over their harassment towards him. Hriskar seems to think that Fargoth is stashing it somewhere in town and asks for your aid in finding it. If you inquire further about the hiding place, he'll say that he's already checked all over Fargoth's house for it, but to no avail. If the player finds it, he says he'll give you a share of the wealth. By declining the offer, he says he'll find someone else that'll do it. Seemingly, this answer locks you out of the quest and there's no way to continue it, unlike in Fargoth's Ring. If you said you'll do it, Hriskar gets excited and tells you what he knows so far. Apparently, Fargoth goes for a walk every night around town. The best area to watch his movements and to see where he goes would be from the top of the lighthouse. Hriskar insists that if you keep an eye on him, you're likely to find Fargoth's hidden stash. Leaving Aryl's trade house, you can follow Hriskar's instructions and shoot straight for the tower. Entering inside, ascending all the way up, and then emerging out onto the upper level, the player has a view of the entire village. Waiting until nightfall, you look all over to see if Fargoth is on the prowl. Eventually, you may lay eyes on the Wood Elf wielding a torch sneaking around Seyda Neen. Eyeing him for a bit and watching his every movement, he'll wander to various spots on the western side of town. He moves to one of the sea banks, then a tree, and then over to the small green swamp behind a couple of houses. At any point, the player can jump down and get in closer, as it seemingly doesn't affect Fargoth's movement. After spending some time in the swamp, hovering over a tree stump, he moves along and rounds the corner of the trade house. Upon closer inspection of the marsh, it turns out that the tree stump is actually hollowed out. Looking inside of it, it contains the engraved Ring of Healing, in which you could have originally given back to Fargoth. It also contains a sum of 300 gold as well as a journeyman's lockpick. Fargoth is still sneaking around town, and if you approach to speak with him while he's crouched, he'll ask if you're following him and says to go away. Once he's done his nightly routine and is stood back up, he says that you're not interrupting anything important and asks if he can help you with anything. You have the option of asking him about his hiding place, which results in him becoming defensive and evasive towards the question, ending with him saying that he wants to be left alone. This prompts an automatic end to the conversation and also leads to a disposition decrease of 10 points, although it is kind of fun to watch him get flustered. Returning back to the trade house and reporting back to Hriskar, he opens up the conversation with asking if you found the hiding spot. Bringing up the topic, he's happy about the player's efforts and splits the gold into 2/3 for him and 1/3 for you. He also insists on letting you keep all of the items that were in there, so the engraved ring and the lockpick. Asking again about the hiding place, Hriskar says he's going to make Fargoth pay for holding out on him, but admits he finds it funny to mess with him. He states that he goes into Fargoth's house from time to time, takes an item, and places it in the barrel of the Census and Excise courtyard for new arrivals to find. Pretty much like how the player would have stumbled upon the engraved ring. And that's about as far as the quest lines involving Hriskar and Fargoth go. At any point, if you return to Fargoth after all is said and done, he'll open by saying that there's no point in robbing him as the Imperials have already taken everything. When asked about his hiding place, he'll say that he doesn't have one, at least not anymore. If you had declined Hriskar's offer, even by going to the lighthouse and waiting until nighttime, Fargoth won't skulk around the village and therefore never replenish his hiding spot. You can also choose to not go back to Hriskar with the loot, resulting in you keeping all of the gold. If you go back to him with less than 300 gold and tell him about the hiding spot, he'll be disappointed and ask if you're holding out on him, resulting in a disposition decrease of 10. If you've managed to kill Fargoth, Hriskar will reprimand you for your actions, claiming he was a good source of income, and then finishes off with saying he's going to act like he doesn't know you. Lastly, you still have the option to hand over the ring to Fargoth, even after completing Fargoth's hiding place, although it can't be retrieved via the tree stump after doing so. All in all, Fargoth's story goes beyond a simple shakedown and robbery. Although it is an excellent way for new players to get a sum of gold in the early game, it demonstrates how the Imperial Legion has corruption within it and that there's a fair share of power-hungry soldiers. It shows how they have oppressed and taken advantage of the citizens of Morrowind, and ultimately sheds light to an overarching story that lurks in the background of the game. Fargoth's story is one of the few that we actually get to hear about. There are countless other interactions between the Legion and Morrowind citizens that go far beyond robbery and thievery. Hriskar himself even says that he shakes down practically all of the citizens of Seyda Neen in order to get some extra pocket change. It's outlanders like these that prove that the Nerevarine needs to come back to Morrowind sooner than later. An interesting last tidbit about the ring, according to the unofficial wiki, is that Fargoth's family heirloom was going to be included somewhere in the Shivering Isles DLC of Oblivion. Unfortunately, the idea in of itself was scrapped, but its ID can still be found within the game's files. Also, in the Census and Excise office, located in the room where the player initially finds the dagger, is a note directed to Hriskar Flatfoot from Ganseal. The note tells Hriskar not to forget about their wager, and that Ganseal wants the dagger to be sharpened by morning. Whether this wager is supposed to refer to the game of Nine Holes, or something to do with shaking down the citizens, is up to interpretation, although I believe it's the former. With that, thus ends the quests, Fargoth's Ring, and Fargoth's Hiding Place. The next quest for today takes place in the starting village of Seyda Neen, and is called Vodunius Nuccius. It's actually pretty easy to miss this one if you're like me and don't talk much with the locals. One of the NPCs in this small fishing village is named Vodunius Nuccius. He hangs around the Census and Excise office, so he could be one of the first citizens that you lay eyes on. I've spoken to him many times before, asking for his help with solving crimes and getting advice on the area, but he's never spoken about himself. Talking with him, he asks if there's anything he can help me with. I asked for a little advice, and Vodunius told me to take a silt strider to the surrounding towns of Vivec or Balmora, as it's fast and cheap. He directs me over to Darvaim Halaran at the silt strider port. Finally, he says to tell her that Vodunius Nuccius sent me. It's interesting because this could have very well been one of the first conversations a new player has with an NPC. Ask for some advice, and they tell you some pretty useful things, especially with regards to the silt strider. Exiting the conversation and following his instructions, the silt strider port, which can obviously be seen from afar, is right over the bridge and to the right. Approaching the Dunmer, Darvaim, she introduces herself as the caravaner of Seyda Neen and asks if I'd like to go anywhere. Before giving her my business, I tell her that Vodunius sent me. She remarks that he's always sending business her way and that in exchange she does favors for him, whatever those may be. She then calls him a poor fellow, citing that she doesn't think he's very happy in the province. There's no more new information here with Darvaim in regards to Vodunius. Taking the initiative to check in on him and seeing what's wrong, I spoke with Vodunius again. Asking about himself, he confirms that he's indeed not happy here in Morrowind. He says that if he had the money for it, he'd be sailing off to Narsis, which interestingly is still in Morrowind, just not on Vvardenfell. He says that he came here to make a fortune, but all he has to show for it is a cursed ring. He then makes me a pretty bad offer. He wants me to buy it off of him for 100 gold, the exact amount that it costs to go to Narsis. He says the ring is worth more than that, but no one wants it because there's a negative side effect. Tapping it increases movement speed, but saps some of the user's HP. He begs for the exchange though, and says it would really help him out. I do it, if only to be nice, and he thanks me, calling me a lifesaver. Ecstatically, he says he's jumping on the next ship out of here, and wishes me better fortune than he had. Looking at the ring, it's not the worst, but not very good either. It damages health for 10 points for 1 second, but fortifies athletics for 5 points for 60 seconds. If I really wanted the extra buff, it wouldn't be so bad, but I'll probably just sell it for some pocket change. Interestingly, after leaving the village and then coming back, Vodunius is nowhere to be found. It would seem he really did hop on a boat to Narcissus, which I think is pretty cool. Darvaim has nothing further to say on the matter, as she just repeats the same message. The ring is the reward here, but if you are really keen on it, you could break into his now vacant home within the village. There's nothing of immense value in here though. There are mostly ingredients which could be nice for the budding alchemist. There's a small locked chest which looks enticing, but it only holds silverware. Granted, there's 6 sets of each piece, and the value they can be sold for would really help out lower level players. Beyond that, there isn't much more to this beginner-friendly quest, and thus concludes Vodunius Nuccius. Let's hear the story of the murdered Taxman, and solve the mystery as to who could have committed such a crime, featured in the Elder Scrolls III Morrowind. As per usual, the facts and information provided are brought to you by the game itself and the unofficial Elder Scrolls pages. The quest, Death of a Taxman, begins in the starting village of Seyda Neen. Wandering around town, the player may speak with its citizens and inquire about the latest rumors. Most will talk about the island of Solstheim and the troubles that are occurring up at Fort Frostmoth. However, once that rumor has been passed along, some citizens may speak of another. Almost any NPC can tell you this information, but for this segment, I went inside of Aurel's trade house and spoke with Tandram and Dallin.
What brings traveler?
He welcomed me to Seyda Neen, calling it the swamp fever capital of the world, which I had never heard of before. He offered to tell me where the services were and also about the latest rumors around town. Inquiring about the latter, he lowers his voice and says that he heard the local tax collector, Processus Vitellius, has gone missing. He follows up by saying it's no surprise and he wasn't well liked around here. This rumor doesn't technically begin the quest in your journal, but it does inform you of the missing person, his controversial occupation, and his reputation around town. If you weren't privy to exploring around the local banks and marshes of Seyda Neen, there's a great chance that this next part would have taken some time for you to happen across. Wandering up and down the sea banks to the west-northwest parts of town, you'll come across numerous mud crabs and rats. While they're seemingly easy creatures to defeat, they hide a troubling and dark secret. In a little nook surrounded by flora, rocks, and animals lays the lifeless body of Processus Vitellius. Examining his body, he has 200 gold on him, as well as the tax records and his commoner clothing. This is where the journal update occurs, and the quest is officially registered. Taking a closer look at the tax records, it displays a list of Seyda Neen citizens and the amounts they owe to the Imperial Legion. Beside the values, most of them have it checked off as to whether they've paid up or not. A lot of the values differ, as some citizens pay as little as 54 drakes, while others, like Aurel, need to pay 450. There are 5 names on the list who have not been marked off as paid yet. Those are Eldifier, owing 130 gold, Fargoth owing 111, Finemouth owing 54, Foreign Gilnith owing 225, and Vodunius Nuccius owing 87. With the tax records in hand, I rushed back to town and decided to speak with the guard about what I had just found. He seemed rather uninterested in my presence, telling me to move along. I told him about the murder of Processus Vitellius, and received quite a shocking response in return. He unenthusiastically said, "Found his body, huh?" and then said it's up to me with what I'd like to do with that information. He mentions that Socussius Urgala at the Census and Excise office would be the best one to tell this to, if that's what I choose to make happen. Exiting the conversation, I was really surprised about what the guard had to say. It made me wonder if the tax collector role has had occurrences like this before, or that maybe Processus really was a corrupt man. I went into the Census and Excise office, and made my way all the way back to the first room containing Socussius and Gansiel.
What's this then?
Speaking with Urgala, he asked what I wanted. I brought up the murder of the tax collector and received a more on par reaction with what I was expecting. Urgala was disappointed to hear about his death, calling Vitellius a good man. He wondered why he hadn't heard from him in a couple of days, citing these as dangerous times and this sort of thing can happen. He then met my second expectation of asking me if I had encountered all of the collected tax money, explaining that he has a job to do and he doesn't mean to be so blunt. I was then faced with 2 options. The first one was to say yes, and hand over the 200 septims. The other was to lie and say that I didn't find anything. I chose to hand over the 200 drakes. Urgala responded that it was odd that Vitellius was murdered but not robbed. He appreciates my honesty and says that if I'm looking for a little extra money, he'd like to see me find the murderer. The crime is apparently punishable by death, and I'm asked to bring this person to justice for a total of 500 septims. Leaving the office, I thought it would be a good idea to start with the citizens who haven't paid their taxes yet. Glancing at the records to see who the 5 were, I approached the closest one to me, Vodunius Nuccius. Vodunius asks me what my question is, and I inquire about the murder of Processus Vitellius. He responds in a similar manner to the Imperial Legion Guard, but remarking that someone finally got him. He details that it's no surprise, as no one likes a tax collector, especially one who flaunts their wealth. He goes on to say that no one could tolerate the man, except for Thavir at the lighthouse. Apparently, the two of them spent quite some time together. He ends with saying he feels bad for her, as she seems like a nice woman. Unfortunately for my curiosity, anyone else I spoke with had the same response to this topic, citing that he wasn't well liked, but the Veer at the lighthouse was very close to him. Going over to the tower and entering inside, she opens up with the same dialogue as Tandra Mandalin. She welcomes me to the swamp fever capital of the world and asks if I want to know about the services or latest rumors. I bring up the murder of Vitellius, and it comes as quite a shock to her. She seemingly didn't know of his death, although many believed him to just be missing. She's in disbelief and says that he was the gentlest man she ever knew. They had become very close in the past few months, and she doesn't know what to do without him. She ends off her statement by saying she's only ever seen him get angry once or twice, and that he's never raised a hand at anyone. Asking further about Vitellius getting angry, Thavir says that it was hardly anger, more so an argument between him and the citizen Thorin Gilneth. The two were having a dispute about the owed taxes, as Thorin believed Vitellius was asking for more gold than required, resulting in him skimming from the top. Thavir says that's ridiculous though, as he would never do such a thing, saying that she's sure of it. She wants me to find out what happened and asks me to find Process's ring in order to give it back to her. Inquiring about the ring, she gave it to him some time ago and would like it back to remember him by. Leaving the lighthouse, it admittedly took me a while to find Thorin Gilneth. He's located inside of his house, beside Fargoth's hollow tree stump behind the trade house. I had never wandered in there before, much less bothered to look at who it belonged to. Entering inside the shack, Thorin was just standing there, almost as if awaiting my arrival.
Speak, traveler.
Speaking with him, he asked what I wanted. I brought up the murder of Vitellius, and he outright admitted to committing the crime. He practically boasted about it. He called him a fetcher and said he had killed him, remarking it to be a good thing that he did. He sticks with his story of accusing Vitellius of skimming from the top. He states that Vitellius would overcharge and pocket the difference. He also says that Vitellius was flaunting his money, showing off his new clothes and jewelry. He murdered him and left the body to rot, with all of the gold still on him. It's here that I'm faced with two choices. One is to believe in what he's saying and tell him that I won't say anything to the authorities. The other is to tell him that it's no excuse for murder and that his punishment has already been decided. By choosing the former, he says it's the truth and that the Legion have been gouging the citizens for years. He claims that the whole office is corrupt and that one of these days they'll all get exposed. He takes pity on Thavir, however, and hands over the ring she gave Vitellius so that I may give it back to her. Returning back to the lighthouse,
Speak, traveler.
I bring up Process's ring to her and she's happy that I'd found it. She's still saddened by his death and rewards me with 2 standard potions of healing, stating that Vitellius used to carry these while out on the job, and maybe that if he had them, he'd still be alive. Exiting the conversation, the rest of the town's citizens have all practically forgotten the murder, as it's no longer a dialogue option. Even back at the Census and Excise office, Urgala has nothing to say on the matter. In my opinion, this is the worst ending in terms of rewards, as all you get in return for your efforts are 2 health potions. Now, going back to the second option of challenging Gilneth for his crimes, he says I'm quote-unquote one of them and tells me to give it my best shot for killing him, finishing off with stating he doesn't mind spilling the blood of more Empire lackeys. Thorin fights with his fists and doesn't hit very hard. At the time of the fight, however, I had really low stamina, so he kept knocking me to the ground and wailing on me. I had to leave his house, rest until healed, and then I was able to return and kill him in 3 casts of frost magic. Here, I went into his inventory and took his small sum of gold along with Vitellius' ring. Recommended is to loot his house as it's no longer considered stealing and he won't be needing any of it anymore. The biggest piece of loot is the book, A Dance in Fire, as it raises mercantile skill and has a decent value attached to it. Leaving Gilneth's home, the dialogue exchange with Thavir is exactly the same as the other ending. She's happy about the ring being recovered and gifts you 2 health potions. It's interesting though that she never inquires about who killed Vitellius. Returning back to the Census and Excise office and speaking with Argala, he notes hearing about my efforts around town and is glad that it's all said and done. He gives me my reward of 500 gold and remarks that it's good to see there are still citizens loyal to the Empire. That pretty much wraps up this quest. Technically, this was the second best ending in terms of rewards. According to the unofficial Elder Scrolls wiki, the most optimal way of doing this quest for a decent payout is to confront Foreign Gilneth immediately after locating the body. This still results in a fight to the death, but upon going to the Census and Excise office, the dialogue will skip straight to testifying about the murderer, and will result in you keeping the tax money along with the 500 gold reward. The only thing you lose out on is Thavir's potions and information, but this seems like a pretty good trade-off. On the lower tier of endings is by telling Argala in the beginning that you did not find the money from the tax collector. He will simply thank you for your efforts and send you on your way. This results in 200 gold plus time saved, but the 500 or 700 gold endings seem to be worth the time, especially to lower level players. Now, it isn't really for me to decide who was in the right and who was in the wrong here. However, there are some clues and pieces of information that could shed more light on this matter. None of the citizens or guards in town were surprised to hear that Processus Vitellius was killed. In fact, the citizens said that he had it coming, as he would commonly flaunt his wealth whilst taking the gold from everyone. He wasn't very well liked, except by Thavir in the lighthouse. Even by the demeanor of the guards, it seems though that none of them were surprised of his death. Whether this is because of the job position in of itself, or his alleged corruption is unknown. Now, while speaking with Gilneth, his main issue with Vitellius was that he believed him to be charging more gold for taxes than what was needed, and the difference Vitellius would keep for himself. Now, the only 2 people in this town vouching for Vitellius' character are Thavir Vedrano and Socusius Argala. Argala simply calls him a good man and that it was a shame he had to die like that. Thavir, on the other hand, claimed that he was the gentlest man she had ever met. They had apparently been close for a few months and she rarely ever saw him get angry. The only times he would express that sort of emotion would be while disputing amounts owed to the Empire with Foreign Gilneth. It seems as though the only other piece of evidence left to examine would be what Vitellius had on him at the time of his death. He had commoner clothing, the ring gifted to him by Thavir, 200 gold, and the tax records. The ring was a present and his clothes didn't seem very fancy. As for the gold, he could have just collected from Gerard and Thirlas, who owes that exact amount in taxes. The only thing that is odd, however, is just how much Foreign Gilneth owes. He needs to pay 225 gold in taxes, which is the second most and exactly half of what Arl needs to pay. The only thing is that Arl runs the only shop nearby, so 450 drakes is fitting. But Gilneth is seemingly a commoner. Due to his living conditions, he likely doesn't have that much income. So why is he being taxed far more than most of the people on this list? Well, perhaps he has a business that we're not aware of. Maybe Gilneth has refused to pay taxes for a while, so it keeps adding on. Maybe Gilneth has proved such a hard time for Vitellius that he only overcharges him out of spite. Perhaps Vitellius is inflating the numbers and we just don't hear anything about it. Or maybe Vitellius isn't even the one tracking the numbers and amounts owed. Maybe he's just the messenger and got caught up on the wrong end of the deal. Perhaps Vitellius was only kind to Thavir, a person of interest, and that's the only side of him she ever knew. After all, if Hriskar Flatfoot is any indication, the Legion has a tight grip around the citizens of Seyda Neen. Fargoth the Wood Elf can even vouch for that. There's a lot of unanswered questions, so an exact conclusion is almost impossible to come to. I'd love to know your thoughts on this, and until next time, keep on adventuring.